All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Anderson. We've still got some people joining us, but I think we can go ahead and just get started with our housekeeping here. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Again, my name is Eric Anderson. I'll be the moderator. And as Jake mentioned, today's topic is fun facts about the FARs. So we'll take a look at some common regs and how they apply to our real-world flying. And then we'll also dive into some regs that are often interpreted by pilots. And as Jake also mentioned, our presenter is Tom Letts. A little background on Tom. He started his career with Jeppesen in 2001. He currently serves as an implementation specialist, and Tom is very active in our Denver area flying community and in our company flying club. We hope to make this an interactive discussion, so please submit your questions throughout the presentation. We'll have some time at the end for Q&A, so we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And also note that you will automatically receive FAA Wings credit for viewing the webinar today. That'll do it for the housekeeping, and we'll go ahead and turn it over to Tom for the presentation.
Good morning and afternoon and evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is a treat that I get to spend some time with you about these things called federal aviation regulations. A little bit about me, Eric talked about it. I am fully invested in aviation between pilot certificates and ratings. I'm also a FAST team representative. I do a lot of work with EAA as far as Young Eagles. We do some charity events around the city of Denver, and they've crowned me chief pilot, which just says I got to make sure all the paperwork is in order. I've actually worked with Gamma, and I am a 4-time builder of Build-A-Plane, which is where high school kids go up to Glass Air and build a Sportsman in 2 weeks. So it's kind of fun. And I look at regulations as a guide. You know, a lot of people look at regulations as though they're these bad things, and we have to know them, and we memorize them for our private pilot check ride. But we don't really want to abide by them. But really, if you think about the federal aviation regulations or the FARs, they're there to guide us and help us through our aviation life. The Air Commerce Act of 1926 is where it all started. The government went and asked the Wright brothers, hey, do you guys want to be self-governing like the American Bar Association, lawyers, if you will? And the Wright brothers said, you know, we're way too busy doing what we're doing, and we don't want to take on that responsibility. So in 1926, President Calvin Coolidge signed the Air Commerce Act into law. And it wasn't until a few months later that he announced the first head of the Air Commerce Act, and that was William P. McCracken Jr. He became the first director. A little bit about Mr. McCracken. He actually helped draft the Air Commerce Act, and the reason for that is he was a lawyer. Not only was he a lawyer, but he was a World War I Army pilot. He was chairman of the American Bar Association on aviation law, and he helped other organizations like the Contract Air Mill. So he was fully into aviation, if you will. And so that's how the Air Commerce Act came about. Now, the birth of aviation with the FAA actually came about in 1958. So it started in 1958, and that's where the FAA, Federal Aviation Agency, started. A little bit about that. In 1956, over the Arizona desert, well, actually the Grand Canyon, there was a mid-air collision between two rather large aircraft. All the people on board both aircraft died, and this wasn't acceptable. So let's see here. So Dwight D. Eisenhower at the time, he was the president, decided that he wanted to introduce a bill to basically start the FAA. So that's how the FAA started. The mantra of the FAA is aviation, safety first in aviation, always. And so if you look at some of the regs, it's all about safety. There are times when we call the regs blood regs because people perished, and then they decided, well, we need to make a regulation in order to stop that from happening again. With the exception of fractional ownership like net jets, which were actually written proactively versus reactively, most of the regulations are written after something tragic happens. So what is the definition of general aviation? General aviation is all flight activity of every kind except that done by the uniformed armed services and scheduled airlines. So what are we talking about? Recreational flying, public benefit missions, normal flying, enforcement, fire suppression, flight instruction, freight hauling, passenger charters, crop dusting, and other aerial activities. So that's general aviation. It's you and I. If you're on this webinar and you're a commercial pilot, that's great. But at some point, you are a general aviation pilot, and that's why you're here, is to learn about these regs, because as a commercial pilot, although you do have regs that you have to follow, a lot of the regs get absorbed by the type of flying that you do. So we're just going to look at a few of them. Accident rates. I'm not going to touch on this a lot, but because of all the due diligence that we've done in the aviation community, which includes writing new regulations, the accident rate has actually gone down and the fatality rate has actually gone down. So, bravo to the regulations, bravo to everybody that follows them and really understands them. It's a good thing to have that. So, what part of the regulations do you fall under? And why is it called 14 CFR now? Interesting fact that since 1958, we've always called it FARs, Federal Aviation Regulations. Yet in the government, in the US government, we actually have another FAR, and it is the Federal Acquisitions Regulations, and they're Title 48, and we're Title 14. So if you notice over the last, 5 to 10 years, maybe 15 years, because I'm old, so it's been probably longer than that, we now go by 14 CFR, and then whatever part we're looking at, whether it's Part 91 or 61 or 135 or 121 or Part 23, we're looking at those. So today we're going to look at some of the ones that are near and dear to my heart. The first three, I call them the threes, the big threes. And they encompass pretty much everything that we do. There's some other ones that we're going to look at, like 6151, but for the most part, we're going to stay in Part 91. For those of you that are flight instructors, you know that there's other regulations that we look at to govern how we instruct and what needs, what the student needs or the learner now. If you haven't seen that all the new books, instead of being called a student. It's now being called a learner. So for those of you learning to fly, you are no longer a student, you're a learner. But we're going to go through a few of these. So now you know why it's 14 CFR. So 91-103. What is important about this? Well, for an IFR flight, you have to know the weather and fuel requirements and alternate requirements for a flight. So you need to know a little bit about the weather. But for all other flights, you need to know about the airport. You need to know runway lengths at the airport of intended use and the following takeoff and landing distance information. And if you're familiar with the picture that you're looking at, this is Lexington, Kentucky. And if you remember several years ago, there was an accident that happened in Lexington that it was due to the fact that the pilots, I won't say they were not paying attention or lackadaisical or feeling comfortable in their situation, but they kind of got lost where they were on the airport. And unlike today, where we have these really cool things like ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot and whatever other iPad or Android app that you use, we can see where we are on the airport at any given time. But when this happened, which was the early 2000s, they didn't have this technology. So what happened was they took off on 2.7. And as you see, 2.7 is way shorter than 2.2. And they got disoriented. Did they look at their compass, which is something we teach learners or students? No, they probably didn't. And there's a few other factors. There's just one person in the tower, and they were actually doing paperwork when they cleared them for takeoff. They actually weren't watching the aircraft in their takeoff role. So quite interesting about this. But this falls under part 91-103, pre-flight action. They need to know everything about the airport. Did they? They probably did. Did they brief it? Maybe they didn't brief it as well as they should have. So what happened was the plane took off on a shorter runway, didn't have enough runway length to take off, ended up hitting a berm at the end of the runway, and everybody but the co-pilot perished. So does 91.3 apply to us? Absolutely it does. It's one of those regulations that even though we may not think about it in our daily lives, when we go out to the airport, when we do a flight, we think about it. If we're at an airport, okay, so are we going to use this really cool thing that ForeFlight has called Internet ADS-B, so we can see where all the traffic is on the runways and stuff, so we can pick which runway would be more suitable for us? We can do that. But we're always thinking about where we are on the airport. A lot of pilot deviations happen because pilots, especially going to an unfamiliar airport, they get lost of where they actually are. So by having an airport diagram where you can see where you are and you're actually moving thanks to GPS is a very helpful thing, and it should give you better situational awareness so that you don't get lost. There's lots of cases about 91-103. But this is the one I wanted to highlight because it was so tragic that they really forgot where they were on the airport. So 91.3, the responsibility and authority of the pilot command. I love this reg because it says we can deviate from any of the regs to meet the needs of the emergency. So the pilot command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and is the final authority to the operation of that aircraft. What does that really mean? It means the pilot command has full responsibility for the safety of that flight. In an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot command may deviate from any rule to meet the extent of that emergency. Have you all experienced emergency? Some of you probably have. Some of you probably haven't. I remember taking off with a fellow member of our little flying association, and about 500 feet off the ground, we were losing power in the engine. And so we requested to land on a different runway, and the person I was flying with wanted to make this standard FAA traffic pattern. I'm like, no, 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 no. We're going straight to the numbers. We went straight to the numbers, and you know, it wasn't his best landing, but we landed, and as soon as the wheels touched the ground, the engine quit. And he said, oh, Tom, that wasn't my best landing. I said, that was the best landing you've ever had, because had you done a standard FAA traffic pattern, we would have landed short because the engine quit. So that was perfect. So just to go into this a little bit more, if we decide to deviate from an FAR, we may be asked by the administrator to give a written report about the deviation. We may not, you know, it could be something very simple, and we may never be asked to give a report. But just so you know, we can do a report. So the example I want to give is this gentleman was flying his home built, which was a Rans S10, and he was just enjoying a beautiful day. And as you can see in the picture, it was just a beautiful day to go flying. Well, what happened was the propeller came off. The engine was still turning, but there was no propeller. He had the sense of where he was. He declared an emergency. He landed at the closest airport and made a beautiful landing, dead stick landing, no engine, you know, no power to a propeller. There was no propeller. So this is a great one. Are there other examples? Sure. Probably the one you know the best is Sully Sullenberger with landing in the river, right? Bird strike, engines went out, glided into the river, everybody survived. So there's lots of examples we can give with 91.3. Now, when we think of a unlucky number, what number do we think of? And that number, hopefully for you, is 13. And this is the regulation that calls for careless or reckless operations. And it says an aircraft operation for the purpose of air navigation. No person may operate an aircraft in a careless or reckless manner so as to endanger the life or property of another. Did you know that this is the regulation? If the FAA really wants to violate you, which right now the FAA is trying to be a kinder, more gentler organization. So lately they've been giving a lot of instruction and talks about things so they don't have to violate you. But if you do something deliberately, they will get you under an FAR or Federal Aviation regulation. And 9 times out of 10, if they can't find something, this is the one they'll use, 91.13. And it also says an aircraft operation other than for the purpose of air navigation, no person may operate an aircraft other than for the purpose of air navigation on any part of the service in the airport used by an aircraft for air commerce. What it's talking about is even at the airport, we can't be hot dogs, because if we are, or we try to do something that is not a normal operation, and trust me, the FAA has a lot of legal renderings that talks about what a normal regulation or a normal operation is. So we don't want to be a hot dog around the airport. We don't really want to be a hot dog anywhere in the airplane. We want to use it for its intended purpose, and that is to get us from A to B safely. Do people do things in aircraft that they probably shouldn't? Absolutely. As you can see in this picture, the person is in a strutted Cessna doing a loop. Most Cessnas, except for the Aerobat that I'm aware of, are not rated to do aerobatics. So Is this a wise thing? No. If the FAA saw this, could they violate you? Probably. Which regulation would they do it under? Probably 9113. So I'll give you an example. This one happens to be a P-51. And what happened is in Montana, a report came into the police station that an unidentified P-51 Mustang buzzed the crowd and tailgaters just before a football game. Okay, as we know, there's TFRs, right? And a TFR starts an hour before the scheduled time of the event until an hour after the time in which the event stops. Okay, and so guess what? There was enough eyewitnesses that the FAA had to research this, and they found that this person was over a congested area below 1,000 feet AGL and of objects on the ground and in the vicinity of a sporting event stadium. So what they get them for? 9113, careless or reckless. Here's another one for this that we're going to look at differently, though. We're going to look at 9119 for minimum safe altitudes. If you're in the Denver area, which is where I live, when we fly, one of the fun flights to do is to fly around downtown Denver. I never go below 7,000 MSL because the highest obstacle in downtown Denver is just a few feet shy of 6,000 MSL. So we had to be 1,000 feet above and 2,000 feet horizontal. So here's a good one. What about minimum safe altitudes? It says over a congested area, which is a town or city, we have to be 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle and 2,000 feet horizontally. So what about non-congested areas? An altitude of 500 feet above the surface, except over open water or sparsely populated areas. In those cases, the aircraft must not be operated closer than 500 feet to any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. So for you flight instructors, have you ever gone out to a remote area where it's sparsely populated, pull the engine on your student and said, okay, we're going to do emergency landing, and you take it down to about 30 or 40 feet above the ground, then you add power and off you go? I have. What I found is emergency landings over congested areas where we have to break off from that emergency landing 1,000 feet above doesn't really give the assurance to the student whether they could have or would have made that landing spot. So by going out to a sparsely populated area, you can do that. The FAA has not defined the term congested area by regulation and doesn't use a mathematical formula, but through interpretations of this regulation, they have a whole bunch of legal interpretations which they'll go back to. And I'll talk about legal interpretations here in a little bit. But hopefully now, minimum safe altitudes, it gives you a better understanding that if we're over a city or a congested area, we need to be 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle. What if you're 900 feet above? Well, you know, if we're going to practice good airmanship, we'll always be 1,000 feet or higher. When somebody calls in and complains about you flying lower than 1,000 feet, one of the things that I've heard that's been asked by airport operations and that type is, well, did you get their N number? No, they're too high. Well, okay, at 1,000 feet, it's pretty hard to see an N number, even the 12-inch N number. Now, there's other ways to find out the N number through FlightAware and other things, but as pilots and as certificated pilots, We want to be as professional as we possibly can. So minimum safe altitude is something that we should always think about when we're flying. And this just goes into a little bit more information. Another example of this was a man was accused of flying a small private plane close to a football stadium during a collegiate football game. You know, when I learned to fly, which is a very long time ago, this was not really enforced, and there were people that were like buzzing football stadiums. I mean, almost to the point of going in and out of the stadium. But now with the advent of ADS-B and several other things, Big Brother's watching us every time we get into an airplane. So we want to be professional about the way we go about things. The other thing I want to talk about is if for some reason you get the dreaded call on the radio, November 505, Juliet Foxtrot, there's a possible point of a pilot deviation. Are you ready to copy a landline? Okay, so which means that we might have done something wrong, and they want us to call either the tower or the center or somebody to find out what's going on. The best thing I can tell you to do is, because air traffic control and a tower and anybody associated with the FAA is bound by these regulations, the best thing I can tell you to do is when you call, be very humble, let them know what you thought, and then they'll let you know what they saw, and you probably can work it out there. If not, you may get some counseling, and counseling in the form of, let's just chat for 10 minutes and that's good. Very few times have I seen where they've taken certificate action, especially lately, if you're humble about it. If you're very arrogant about how you go about flying, they have no choice but to take certificate action against you. And we don't want that. Here's a fun reg. 91-165, and I apologize for the VFR pilots that don't have their instrument rating yet, but this is a good one. I have taught FAA 121 dispatch class for several years, close to 10 years. And one of the regulations is 9169, IFR flight plan, information required. And if you are an instrument pilot, the question is, when do you need to file an alternate? The answer is always. Now you're gonna go, wait a minute, Tom. That's not true. You're looking at the exception. The actual regulation says, unless otherwise authorized by ATC, each person filing an IFR flight plan must include the following information. And number 2 says, except as provided in paragraph B of the section, an alternate airport. So the regulation says that we have to file an alternate all the time, but there's an exception. And the exception is the 1123 rule, an hour before to an hour after, if the ceiling is at least 2,000 feet and 3 statute miles of visibility, we do not have to file a alternate. But that's not what the regulation stated. The regulation stated is we have to file an alternate, but there's an exception. So if anybody ever asks you, especially for those of you going for your instrument rating, when do you have to file an alternate? The appropriate answer is always. And then talk about the exception of 1123. An hour before to an hour after, 2,000 feet and 3 statute miles. Okay, moving on. This is one that has boggled my mind for a very long time. I've had a lot of people tell me, you know, there's certain things, Tom, that that don't need to work and you still go flying. Okay, I'm okay with that as long as it's documented, it's in-op sticker, and it's documented in the aircraft logbook. I'm okay with that. But here's one that puzzled me, and these are all different things you have to have for VFR flight. But here's one. It talks about for small civil aircraft certified after March 11th of 1996. And for a lot of you, especially if you fly out of a flying club, you fly pretty new airplanes. You fly 1996 or newer aircraft. But in accordance with Part 23, and that's 14 CFR Part 23, and 23 is the regulations that bind how you get a general aviation aircraft certified. According to this 91205 and Part 23 of this chapter, an approved aviation red or aviation white, and the key word is or, aviation red or aviation white anti-collision light system. In the event of failure of any light of the anti-collision light system, operation of the aircraft may be continued to a location where the repairs or replacements can be made. So here's the question, and Cessna does this, and I'm going to pick on Cessna, and I apologize for picking on Cessna, but Cessna does a very good job of this. They have a toggle switch or an on-off switch for the rotating beacon. Is the rotating beacon an aviation approved red light? It is, absolutely it is. Then they have a toggle switch for the strobe lights. Are the strobe lights an aviation white anti-collision light? It is. So one would think, well, I could have one or the other because it says right here, one or the other, red or white. But, and this is an interesting concept, because of Part 23, Part 23 defines the anti-collision system as both red and white, not or, but and. So in my mind is maybe Cessna should have just had one turn on switch. And I know why they didn't, because they didn't want to blind people at night with the strobes turned on. But as pilots, we may forget to put strobes on. And according to this, if the aircraft is newer than March 11th, 1996, we have to have both systems working, okay? And how I know this is, and this is something you all can do, if you are not convinced that you understand a regulation, you can go out to the FAA's website and go to legal interpretations, and you can read about legal interpretations from people submitting them in the past. If you notice, this is dated December 19, 2017, and it gives my name. And it says, requests for legal interpretation regarding the operation of aircraft equipment with in-operating rotating beacon. Okay, and I asked about this, and basically what they came and told me is, well, Tom, as much as you would like to use one or the other, based on our interpretation, based on Part 23, both of them have to be working. And so I'm like, okay, great. It took them almost a full year, and it took almost a dozen lawyers to agree to this. And so as you see, anytime that the FAA puts something in writing, now that becomes a document that you can use in a court of law. So if you ever call the FAA, say you call the FSDO, and you say, hey, can you shoot me an email about FAR 9113 or FAR, I don't know, a different FAR. More than likely, they will not. Matter of fact, they probably will not, because An email is also considered a legal document. They may talk to you over the phone about it because that's a voice, and voice for the most part is not allowed, but anytime you have a document that you can present, that becomes a legal document. So that's why the FAA takes their time. Let's move on to another one. This is a great one. ADS-B. We have heard so much about ADS-B in the past several years about, oh, you got to be ADS-B compliant by January 1st of 2020. Well, we didn't realize that we weren't going to be flying much in 2020 because of COVID, and I'll get into that here in a little bit as well. But so we all got on board. ADS-B, ADS-B. Do we have to have ADS-B in and out? No, the regulation says all you have to have to be compliant by January 1st, 2020 is ADS-B out, so other people can see you, okay? Here's an interesting thing. This regulation talks about all the different things about ADS-B, but it also talks about each person operating an aircraft equipped with ADS-B out must operate this equipment in the transmit mode at all times. So for those of you that like to live life on the edge, or you just don't want to be professional about your flying, and you go out to an area and you want to do some prairie dog flying or coyote flying where you're 30 feet off the ground, which is crazy in my mind because of obstacles and telephone wires and other things, but you turn it off, believe it or not, you're breaking a regulation. Would they get you under 91.225? Probably not. They probably get you under 91.13. But I just wanted to point this out. Does anybody turn theirs off? No, probably not, because it's associated with the transponder most of the time. So you leave your transponder on, and so you're leaving your ADS-B on. Does it really help if you're in the middle of nowhere? Let's say, I don't know, in the middle of Nevada, going between Elko, Nevada, and Reno, Nevada, there's not a whole lot out there, is there? For those that you have flown that area, there's not a whole lot out there. So does it really help? Probably not. But according to this regulation, we have to have it on. Okay. And there's a little bit more about the regulation. Okay, so here's the one that I get the most questions about all the time. And to be honest with you, I had to do a whole bunch of research about pilot in command because as much as the legalese talks about pilot in command, there's a lot of things that are going on right now, especially with the younger certificated pilots that are coming up wanting to become airline pilots. And this is really geared towards those folks. So first of all, let's talk about the definition of pilot command. Pilot in command means the person who has final authority to and responsible for the operation and safety of that flight. That's 91.3, right? Yeah, that's 91.3. Has been designated as pilot in command before or during the flight. And I'm going to talk about that. And holds the appropriate category, class, and type rating if appropriate for conducting or the conduct of that flight. Okay, so we're going to talk about this in great detail because this is the regulation that when you go to the airlines, they're going to really scour your logbooks for. So let's look at it. PIC time logged with 2 pilots, okay? This is a letter. Pilot A flies the aircraft and pilot B acts as pilot in command. Can that happen in a plane that only requires a single pilot? The answer is no. So the way the FAA has talked about logging pilot in command is the person that is sole manipulator of the controls, and I'm just going to go through this for a second. So the person that is sole manipulator of the flight controls is pilot in command. Now, can you say I'm pilot in command of a aircraft that requires more than one crew member, so 2 or more crew member? Absolutely. You can say I'm pilot in command, but the person manipulating the controls actually can log PIC time. So why is this important to talk about? Well, lately I've heard a lot of things about plane sharing. What is plane sharing? Well, plane sharing is when 2 certificated pilots go out, they rent an aircraft together, and we'll just pick a 1-hour block time for now. They go out and they fly for a 1.0. They split the cost. Let's say the airplane was $100 an hour. And for some of you, that is dirt cheap. For some of you, it's like, oh, that's a little expensive. But let's say it's $100 an hour. So pilot A pays 50 and pilot B pays 50. But what really happens after they split the cost of the airplane? In pilot A's logbook, they log 1.0 PIC. And in pilot B logbook, they log 1.0 PIC. So is that really a true statement? No, unless they both were on the controls, which that doesn't happen. One person will be on the controls, and then half hour later, the other person gets on the controls and flies it, and they go back and forth. But to log the whole time saying that you're PIC is incorrect. If you're a flight instructor, you can log the whole time as PIC. If you tell them, you know, that's a yoke, and you're giving instruction, you can log the whole hour as PIC. So what about this thing called a safety pilot? And I'm going to give you an example of this. Safety pilot, when can you log PIC as a safety pilot? Well, the answer is you can only log PIC during the time in which the other pilot is under the hood. Why is this important? Because what's happening is airlines are interviewing and really liking applicants. And so they go through their logbook and they see a 1.5 a safety pilot. And so they'll ask the applicant, okay, so that's 1.5, how long was the flight? And the applicant, without thinking and being honest, said, well, it's a 1.5 flight. So the hiring company says, so what you're telling me is the person was under the hood from the time they started the engine. Oh, no. We went up, did a run up, took off, and about, I don't know, 2 miles away from the airport, they got under the hood. Okay, so the full 1.5 hours was not safety pilot. Yeah, I guess you're right. So then that goes into what other items that were put in that logbook are not factually correct. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of applicants being turned away because what they thought was correct in their mind, what they thought was correct per the regulation, it wasn't. So I'm not trying to get you guys upset, but I'm just trying to show you that the pilot in command, there's a very specific time in which you can log pilot in command, and that is when you are a manipulator of the controls. One person asked me, well, Tom, what if I put the autopilot on? Are you still in command of that autopilot? Are you manipulating the controls of that autopilot? You are pilot in command. Just because you put the autopilot on doesn't mean that you're still not responsible for that. Well, what happens if I let my best friend fly? And they're actually a pretty good pilot, but they're not a certificated pilot. You're still pilot in command because they are not a pilot. So you're still pilot in command. Where does this come in? Anybody that's flown Young Eagles, you know that EAA has this program called Young Eagles, and we as pilots allow this 8 to 17-year-old kid fly the airplane for 10, 15 minutes. We're still pilot in command. So hopefully this helps you understand this regulation 6151, because if you're going for an airline job, it could come back and haunt you. If you're just trying to build hours because you're building hours, great. If you're like me and you're in my age group, I just keep log enough hours to show that I'm current. Although I fly way more hours than I actually log, I just log enough to show that I'm still current, because I'm well past the point of wanting to be in the airlines. But just so you know, the airlines do look at your logbooks. So let's now switch our focus into COVID. So the FAA actually stepped back and said, oh, wow, this COVID thing, especially starting in March, where all pilots pretty much were grounded, with the exception of a few airline pilots. They were like, oh man, this is going to affect all the pilots. And we got to figure out and fast what we can do to help the pilots out so that tests don't expire and things like that. So they created this SFAR, which stands for Special Federal Aviation Regulation. And it's good from June 25th, 2020 through March 31st of 2021. Could it go longer? Absolutely, depending on how bad this stays, the COVID stays. But what this does, and I put the link in here for you, and somehow we'll, if you want it, we'll get it to you. But I put this link in, and for a pilot flight review, and the original SFAR 118 relief said if your flight review was due between March and June of this year, you have a 3-month grace to complete the flight review. So if it was due in June, you have July, August, September, you have till September. And then they said, well, let's go ahead and move it out to July through September, okay? What about a pilot instrument check? So a 9-month currency look back period instead of 6 months for flights. So normally for instrument currency, we look at a 6-month period. Now we can look at a 9-month period. So that's good. Pilot command proficiency check, that's more of a airline type of thing, or Part 135. So let's continue. The only one that I want to talk about here is remote pilot aeronautical knowledge recency. So as you see, if you are a remote pilot, you have a Part 107 certificate. Then as you see, they've given you a little bit of leeway. What about the medical? Validity of March through May 2020 medicals extend to June 30th. Now that's already come and gone. But if you notice, the amended one now goes through September of 2020. So you might want to talk to your AME about that. If you have a basic med, make sure that you go online and take care of that with your basic med. How about a knowledge test? And as we know, knowledge tests are good for 24 months, 2 years. The test results expiring March through June of 2020 are now extended 3 months. Knowledge tests expiring in July through September are also added. So those get extended 3 months. So, and the reason for this is all of the time that we couldn't fly, now that we're back and flying. But here's one. If you're a flight instructor, what about a flight instructor renewal? Yeah, no change. No change really. We had till June but no change. And more than likely, the reason for that is they realize most flight instructors renew their certificates online, and we don't have to be flying to renew it. So that's what that looks like. As far as training goes, be a student of the FARs. Go out there and pick a couple FARs and just go through them. You might have a lot of fun. Training, if you look at this picture, it tells a story, and it's a fun story. This is a left-hand turn with no bank, or very, very little bank. A left-hand turn. And how you can tell is if you have a big enough screen on your computer, you can look at the fuel tanks, and one tank reads full and the other tank reads empty. So the forces are going opposite direction of the turn. It's kind of a good picture. Okay, I am an FAA safety team member, so it wouldn't be right if I didn't talk about the FAA safety team website. The FAST team website actually gives you an opportunity to learn about anything and everything in aviation through courses. You can actually learn about what's it going to take to become a Part 107 small unmanned aircraft, or what we call a remote pilot. What does that take? If you have a current flight review and you are a certificated pilot, all you have to do is take a quiz and you become a Part 107. If you didn't know that, it's kind of cool. But they have all these different courses. You're more than welcome to take any of the courses. Some have a little bit of fee. I would say a majority of them are free. You can see that they're given by all sorts of different people, different organizations. NAFI has some, SAFE has some, AOPA has some, the FAA has some. They're all a lot of fun. When you get done, you get a certificate. You can put it on your wall if you want, or I put it in a 3-ring binder just to know that I did one. This also helps you with the WINGS program. If you're not familiar with the WINGS program actually, if you go through a phase of the WINGS, it actually replaces a flight review. And remember, a flight review is a minimum of 1 hour of flight and 1 hour of ground. Okay, and in the regulation, it talks about some of the key areas that you want to learn. But in the WINGS program, it's a minimum of 3 hours of ground and 3 hours of flight. So that supersedes doing a flight review if you want to do the WINGS program. And if you do, you get these really cool wings. So anyway, that's what I have. Thank you for attending this session. I truly hope that you got a better understanding about a couple regulations. Maybe some of them were not as interesting to you as others, but hopefully one of the regulations I touched on hit home, and hopefully I instilled in you to go out and learn more about that regulation. Remember, if you really want to know the ins and outs of that regulation, go out to the FAA website and look at the interpretation, legal interpretation of that regulation. So Eric, I think I'm going to hand it over to you for some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Great job with that. Lots of great information. So we'll go for a few minutes here on questions, and if we could start with one. I used to know the answer to this back when I was instructing many years ago, but with regard to safety pilots, can you remind us, does a safety pilot need to have a current medical or currently be under the basic med rule, or can you do that without a medical?
Great question, and it sounds like a lot of you posted that because I hear medical and basic med. So the answer is yes, you have to have a medical and or you have to have a basic med current. And here's why: because you become pilot command. And what does the regulations say as pilot command? You have to have a valid and current medical. So the answer is yes.
And then also part of that, the safety pilot has to be rated appropriately for that aircraft, such as airplane single engine land, multi-engine land. Is that correct too?
That is correct. So let's say that you learned your whole time in a Cessna 172, and your friend wants you to be a safety pilot for them, and they want you to go up in a Piper Archer. So Piper Archer is still a single engine land aircraft, so you can act as PIC even though you may not have a lot of time in it or no time at all. Now, with that said, would it behoove you to at least go up and get the feel of the aircraft in case the person that's under the hood becomes incapacitated and you actually have to land the airplane? It does. But per the regulation, you can do it.
Okay. And so question for you, Tom, would you mind if some folks maybe contact you later, and would there be a good way for them to do that?
Absolutely. My home email address, and I will give you that just because my work would probably frown on if I got a gazillion emails. My home email address is, and I'll spell it aviation phonetically, T as in Tango, D as in Delta, .lets, Lima Echo Tango Tango Sierra, at Comcast.net.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you can, we can put that in the chat, or
Sure.
just post up. That might help folks. Thank you for doing that, Tom. There's probably a lot of folks that have some other questions or some specific questions. Thank you for agreeing to talk to some folks. Maybe, let me see if I can find one other here. There was one about making a low approach or a low pass at a non-towered airport. And personally, I don't see any violation of a rule or regulation with that, as long as you're following traffic pattern guidelines and guidelines for that non-towered airport. Is that your take on it, Tom?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The safety person in me says no. The person that looks at the regulation says yes. So here's the quandary for me in this. If you're going to make a low pass, what purpose is the low pass? Are you going faster than approach to landing speed? Are you going, let's say, 130 knots on this low approach or low pass? And then at the end, are you going to pull up more than so many degrees of nose up attitude and or bank? And if that's the case, then you're not in compliance of the regulation. Now, if you're going by and you're going, at an approach speed, and you're going by because you need somebody to look at to see if the gear is down, or you go by because you want to wag the wings to say hi to somebody, I don't see an issue in that. It's the folks that want to do a low flyby at speeds faster than what is appropriate for the landing pattern.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to state it. Here's a good question, maybe from your time doing the build a plane with the kids and experimental aircraft. If you buy an experimental registered aircraft, can the owner sign off on the maintenance, non-A&P AI? Any idea about that one?
So when you build your own aircraft, there's a DAR, a designated airworthiness representative, that will go through your aircraft with a fine-tooth comb to make sure it's airworthy. Make sure the rigging's right, make sure the rivets are properly done, and all of that. After you get your airworthiness certificate, then the owner of the aircraft takes their book of all of the pictures of them building the aircraft, and they take it to the Flight Standards District Office. And this Flight Standards District Office looks at it and looks at the airworthiness certificate and will issue an AMP to that owner of that aircraft for that tail only, to allow you to work on it. As far as buying a home built and wanting to work on it, because you didn't build it, I don't know what that is. So my suggestion for whoever asked that question is call the FSDO, the Flight Standards District Office, and find out from them if you can do more than just owner maintenance, if you can do all the maintenance, meaning you can change out an engine, you can take the wings apart, you can put in new fuel cells, you can redo rivets and all of that. I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did, but I don't.
All right, thank you. Here's a question for the wings program. Let's see if I can summarize this. Do you really need 3 hours of flight for the wings program? I was told you could cover.
Yes.
So you need the 3 hours of flight for the wings program.
Yeah, so it breaks down to three flights, and each flight, there's specific requirements for each flight that you have to meet. And so it ends up being an hour to meet all the requirements of that flight. And there's 3 of those. So at the end of those 3, then you're good. As far as the ground, as long as it's wings certified course, it doesn't matter what you take as far as ground. You can take a mountain class, you can take a Benz class. You know, what happens if I go scuba diving and I want to fly my airplane home? What happens? Or you can take a class on controlled flight into terrain. You can take all these different cool classes or courses, but they're not specific to a section. Now in the wings program, the basic for the basic wings, there's 3 flights. For the next level, there's 3 flights, and each flight has very specific things that are required in that flight.
Okay, thank you. Let's do one more. The safety pilot. Here's an interesting scenario. This is from Richard. So the safety pilot question. So PIC is a new private pilot, so assuming no instrument rating. Can the safety pilot, who is instrument rated, file IFR, then let the new private pilot fly under instrument meteorological conditions and log the time if he is the sole operator or under the hood? So I think that gets into some nuances there. What is your take on that, Tom?
Yeah, so there's some legal interpretation about that. But here's the deal. Once you go into IMC, then you have to be rated. You have to have an instrument rating to fly an IMC. Once that happens, then the person that is instrument rated becomes PIC. Whether or not they're under a hood, if they're in IMC, they become PIC. I know that sounds like what is it? A Robin Williams scene, but Good Morning Vietnam. But I'm sorry. So IMC is instrument meteorological conditions, and PIC is pilot and command. So I'm sorry if I'm saying all these together, but yeah. So if you go into IMC, and then you have to be rated or an instrument rating to fly an IMC, and there you go.
So then conversely, if in visual, meteorological conditions in that scenario, then you would have one person acting as safety pilot, assuming the other one is using a hood or view limiting device. And in that scenario, then the time the person is under the hood, both would log PIC. Is that how you interpret that?
That is correct. The time, so the person that's been flying the whole time can log PIC. And once he or she goes under the hood or view limiting device, as you said, once they go under the view limiting device, then the safety pilot can also log that as PIC. Because if you really think about this, Eric, the person that is acting as PIC because the other person is under a hood, that person can't see that a plane is a quarter mile away from you on a trajectory to hit you. So you got to make an evasive move. The reason for the safety pilot is to have eyes out the window, looking for traffic, looking for things that would disrupt the flight.
Yeah, sure. Okay, do you have time for one more, Tom?
Sure, one more.
Okay, now we're a little bit over here. There's been a few questions on SIC, or second in command. I guess it's been a long time since I've been in these regs, but as I recall, second in command can only be logged if you are in an aircraft that requires more than one crew member, and I think there's the type of operation in there too. Do you know anything about that, Tom? Second in command.
So I know a little bit more, but not a whole lot. But when I talked to the FAA about this, they said what you just said, that second in command is something that you can log when the aircraft requires more than one crew member to fly that aircraft. Now, with that said, second in command is governed by the operation of the company you're working for. They can set when you can log second in command and when you can't. So it's usually the operations of that company that dictates how second in command works, logging.
Right. So you got to be a little bit careful with that one because there are some pretty specific requirements for.
Oh, absolutely.
Log SIC.
Yeah. Normally, planes that require more than one crew member are run by organizations or companies, and they have operation specifications that talk about that. If that person that asked that question is going to fly with somebody that requires more than one crew member, remember that those type of airplanes are probably over 12,500 pounds and or very specific. So you may need additional ratings and certificates in order to actually even fly it. So that may come into play as well. The best thing to do is call the FSDO and get more information on that, or send an email to the FSDO to get it.
Okay, well, thanks. A lot of great discussion here, a lot of great questions. Thanks, everyone. Tom, if you wouldn't mind, let's go to the next slide and we'll kind of start wrapping up here. I know we're a little bit over.
Absolutely.
Okay, just want to mention a couple things before we close out. First of all, thanks again to Tom for the presentation and great discussion. And also like to thank Jake and the team at ForeFlight for hosting us. If you don't know already, we are partnering with AOPA on these Pilot in Command webinars. And I want to mention just quickly a new feature within the AOPA app. It's called Pilot Passport. And Pilot Passport lets you check in at airports you visit. You can share your flights on social media. You can also earn badges and points and rewards. And speaking of points and badges, you can receive both of those for attending this webinar. So just go to the AOPA app and you look in My Pilot Passport, and then at the bottom there's Redeem Affiliate Code. And that affiliate code is FARS, F-A-R-S. Again, that's Redeem Affiliate Code and FARS, FARS. And then there was a number of questions about recording of this webinar. We will indeed post it, and that'll be on forflight.com/PIC, and that'll be up here shortly. And you'll also receive a survey link in your email for this webinar. We would certainly appreciate any feedback you might have for us. And then Tom, if you go to the last slide, please.
Bear with me. Come on, machine. Doesn't want to, oh, wait a minute, there we go.
All right. And lastly, just mentioned our next webinar, and I think the final in the series here will be coming up on Thursday, September 24. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but I think you're also presenting this one for us.
I am. It'll be on avoiding loss of control. So most people talk about loss of control. Really, if we think about it, we want to avoid losing control of the aircraft. So I've retitled it Avoiding Loss of Control.
All right, sounds good. And again, that'll be on September 24th. We'll have the registration link up on that same URL I mentioned earlier. That's forflight.com/PIC, or we'll also be pushing out information via Jefferson's social media channels here in the coming weeks. Okay, that'll do it for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for the great discussion. So long, everybody.